About 10 years ago, Lisa bought me this typewriter, manual typewriter. It's an Underwood. It was made in 1912, the same year as the Titanic. Obviously, the typewriter's in better shape than the Titanic and still afloat and still working. But using the typewriter, which I do a lot, taught me a lot about how to make great video. And that really is the lesson, the insight that I want to share with you today. First about the typewriter. And typing is a lost art or a lost skill, because of course we all live with laptops now, or we type on our phones and stuff like that, but it's the experience that's very different, and it's the essence of the experience that I learned something about creating content, and specifically about shooting video, which is what we do most of the time. But first, to the typewriter. When you type, and probably if you're under the age of 40, maybe you've never typed before, or certainly if you're under the age of 30, when you type, there's a physicality to the typing, the experience of typing. First, the typewriter, because it was made in 1912, it's Victorian kind of design. It's made of steel, and the thing weighs a ton, and it's solid, and it's mechanical, and it's the mechanical aspect of it that's so good. When you type on a phone, you just use your fingers, and even if you type on a laptop. But when you type on the typewriter, there's a mechanical aspect to it. You push these metal keys down, and when you hit the key, a steel key frame comes up and strikes the paper with enormous force. It goes through a ribbon, and the ribbon imprints ink on the paper, and it makes an indentation of the ink. So there's a physicality to typing that it's a pleasure in a way that you don't get, certainly with a phone or even with a laptop. I also like the sound. There's a rhythm to it once you get going. It's almost a musical kind of a thing. And then when you get to the end, a bell rings and you throw the carriage. It's a very, very physical act. And then because it's a physical act, you're much more directly in contact with the act of creative content, creating content. It is a relationship between you and the machine that you just don't get with a phone or an iPad or a laptop or anything like that. It smells. It has a smell to it because you have to oil the thing, and it's just so physical, and you connect directly with the machine in a funny way that you don't do with any sort of plastic stuff that we all use today, or certainly the digital world, in which God knows where the stuff is. I found in my own experience that I use the typewriter a lot when I want to really get in contact with someone. For example, if I'm writing to the CEO of a major media company, which I do a lot to pitch work and stuff like that. If I send an email, it's easy to delete, and everybody sends emails. But if I actually type out a physical letter that they get, a physical thing and an envelope, and mail it to them, I find I very often get responses. I think because it's such an unusual experience to have this physical thing that you can actually hold in your hands, and it sits on the desk and it's not deleted. And also I think when they get a typewritten letter, they open it because they think someone's kidnapped their kids, because who else sends typewritten letters today? Almost nobody. So what was once very common was typewritten. Of course, everything was typewritten. Today, it's a rarity, and that has a power in and of itself. But now to the idea of why this changed the way that I shot video, and why it became kind of a seminal point in the boot camps that we run when we teach MMJs or video journalists to shoot their own video. When you type something, when you type a letter, you can't delete, obviously. So when you type something, you're committed to the letters that you're writing. You're committed to the thing you're writing, because it's one-to-one from the keys, from your head to the keys, and from the keys to the type to the paper. And therefore, there's no going back. There's no looking and go, oh, let me delete that and try it again. So the writing ratio is very much one-to-one. You have to have the idea in your head before you sit down and start to write it. You can't really make it up as you go along, and I'll figure it out, or do your thumbs and just LOL and stuff like that. There's a depth of there's an intellectual aspect to it, which requires you to think before you commit to paper. And when you start to type on the letter, whatever the thing you're typing is, you're committed. The thing you've written is going to be there forever. There's no going back. I mean, you can throw the paper out and start all over again, but you're still in the same place every single time. So there's a commitment to what's going to go on the paper, which we generally don't have in video, because especially in digital video, you can shoot tons and tons and tons of stuff. And then later you get in the edit and you try and figure it out. And there's this notion in video, particularly when we do news stories and stuff like that, of shooting everything. because you're afraid you're going to miss everything. And it's as though I sat down to write a letter someday. I write 1,000 pages, and then I'll go back and I'll pull some stuff and I'll find it. This is not the way the machine works. The machine has a kind of a DNA in it, if you're going to use it, that requires you to think before you strike the keys. And when you strike the keys, you're committed. And there's no backing out and there's no chance. There's something wonderful in that, and it's a real intellectual exercise that the digital world has completely obviated. We don't really have to think in that way. You know, many years ago, we bought Lisa's father when he was in his 80s. We bought him a computer. We lived in New York, and we bought him a computer, and we taught him to do word processing and send emails so that he could communicate with us very easily, because he was not very, he was quite computer literate for somebody in their 80s. And so when we were in England visiting him, I went to this little office where he kept the computer, and I saw him, and he was writing down something on a yellow legal pad. You remember those big yellow legal pads? And I said, Ken, what are you doing? He said, I'm making emails. I said, that's not making emails. I said, you're writing it on the paper. He says, no, first I write it on the paper, and then when I write on the paper and I have it the way I want it, and I can cross it out and I can go fix it and stuff like that, when I have it perfect, then I'll type it on the computer for the email. And I thought, you don't really understand how this works. The thing is, he understood how to compose writing in a much more sophisticated way than I did. And so by the time he got to typing it on the laptop or the computer that we got him, he knew exactly what it was he wanted to say. Oftentimes, particularly with text messages, stuff like that, it's just, or X or Twitter, whatever it's called now, we don't think. It's just an instinctive thing, and there's no thinking in it. We've taken thinking out of it. This often happens in video. The process of thinking and agonizing over what is this story going to look like, what am I going to shoot, what is the final product going to be, has been removed. Because of the digital world, we can shoot on and on and on and on. NPPA, National Press Photography Association, says the standard shooting ratio is 20-1. That is 20 minutes of raw material for every minute that goes on the air. Well, what that means is that you throw away 19 minutes of every 20 that you shoot, or 95% of your work gets thrown away. That is a phenomenal waste. It's a waste of your time in the field. It's a waste of your time when you go to put the thing together. It's a waste of your time when you script. It's a waste of time in your edit, because you're overwhelmed. And in a way, it's confusing because you're overwhelmed with so much material. So when we teach the boot camps, we instruct people basically to try and shoot 1-to-1. We say 3-to-1 because sometimes you do different angles, but essentially before they hit the record button, we want them to think out, what is the story visually that I want to tell here? It's the lesson I learned from the typewriter. Before I sit down and write, whether I'm writing a script or I'm writing an essay or I'm writing a letter, I have to think to myself, what is it very focused that I want to say? What is the idea I want to communicate? And then I can begin to write it exactly as I want it to come out, because there's no opportunity to delete, which actually is no bad thing. So try it if you're shooting video. Try this little lesson that I learned here. Think about, what is the story? What is the piece I want to write? What do I want it to look like? Because it's a visual medium. Just like, what do I want the letter to look like? What do I want the letter to say before I start to write? And you'll find that this forces you to do something we rarely do in video, particularly in news, is think before we shoot. Like I have to think before I write.